So welcome, everybody. Good morning to those in the UK. Good afternoon to those in South Asia itself, and perhaps good morning or very early morning to those in other parts of the world. I'm very delighted to be introducing this first session of the Sustaining Power program, which looks at women's struggles against backlash across South Asia. This program started in January 2020, about 6 years ago. And I've been associated with this program since the beginning, getting a sense of what the proposed research was about and a little bit at the midpoint on how it was going. And I'm delighted now to be hearing more in depth some of the findings of this research. This research is really important because it centers the voices of the activists themselves, the struggles that they're facing, and as you will hear, employs some really interesting and innovative methodologies to try and surface some of the issues that they're grappling with. The voices of the activists were particularly recorded in a session yesterday where they spoke themselves. This will be available online for those who want to watch it later. So I just thought I'd plug that as well. I should say this research comes at a particularly important moment. Polycrisis is almost like a cliche these days. We're facing a world in which, every day some new unfolding and compounding crisis is emerging. And on the one hand, there's the economic impacts of crises everywhere, the climate, etc. And what it's doing is really creating a whole, it's concentrating wealth in the hands of very few people while creating a large precariat of workers who don't have any predictability about their employment. On the other hand, you also have rising authoritarianism, polarization in the political sphere, which is actively clawing back rights that were hard fought many years ago. And in both these trends, the people who suffer the most are the women, because they're sort of at the bottom of all of the economic ladders, the political ladders, their voices aren't heard. So this is a really important and interesting research that's happening here. The session today will go as follows. We have an initial presentation by Deepta, Priya, and Samreen, my colleagues here, who will present the broad framing of the research and the research methodologies, which will be followed by conversations between researchers here at IDS and country researchers in country for 15 minutes each, starting with Pakistan, then going on to Nepal, to India, and to Bangladesh, and we'll have some wrapping up. So that's the plan for today. I'm delighted that my colleagues are here, Shandana Moman, fellow in the governance cluster, Priya Raghavan, also fellow in the governance cluster. All of them are fellows in the governance cluster. Deepta Chopra and Sohela Nazneen, and each of them have taken on sort of analyzing and putting together the findings from a particular country. So they'll be leading conversations from there. We also, for the online audience, will be monitoring the chat. So do put your questions in the chat, and we will have a time after all the speakers have had their chance to speak, to ask questions. Quickly also to say that we're not expecting a fire alarm for those who are here. So if there is a fire alarm that sounds, it's real, and you should go to the fire exit there and move out, or from this side over to the front of the building. There's closed caption hearing for those who are not able to hear. Please turn it on. And I think that's it for the housekeeping. So I will start now by handing over the floor to Deepta, Priya, and Samreen.
Thanks, Anu, and welcome everyone. It's a real honor to have you all here with us and also online. And this is, as Anu said, the second well, actually the third of the program of events that started yesterday. And I will give you a bit of overview, and then we'll go into some findings with Priya and Samreen also giving you some of those things. Okay, so as Anu said, Super started 6 years ago, and what we really want to start with is a note of sincere and heartfelt gratitude for the activists and the women who shared their stories with us, but also who really let us into their spaces, into these very safe spaces that they have constructed for themselves, and whose insights really centrally shaped this research. But also a shout out to the 4 collaborating partners. There is BIGD in Bangladesh, there is CARE in Nepal, there is ISST in India, and there is Ideas in Pakistan, who led the research and whose researchers went beyond and above the call of duty to really work with us and work with the movements at a time when it was like, COVID was hitting right as the program was taking off. So there was a lot of, not so easy to do field work to do that. But also, we want to recognize the continuing and escalating forms of backlash, rising authoritarianism, but also wars, and the ever-urgent need for transnational solidarity. So a big, heartfelt note of solidarity to our colleagues and friends and everyone in Palestine and Gaza, especially in Lebanon, in Iran, and in all those regimes where women's rights are being pushed back. Okay, so we're going to start this presentation with thinking about the questions and the methodology, the key findings, and then looking ahead on what's next. As Anu said, it's a 6-year program started in January 2020. This is a program funded by the UKRI's, by the SRC, the UK government's research funding, research council. And our central question is what is, like in economic parlance called positive deviation. So we were interested in struggles who had some form of success, how would they define their success, and really understand when, why, and how had these struggles really succeeded in retaining power and in sustaining their gains against backlash. And 4 countries, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Nepal. I will not read out the names of these struggles, but just to say that there were 16 struggles, 4 in each of the countries. And the important part of this, which was also part of our methodology, was that this was a joint selection, and it was a joint selection between 3 parties, us at IDS, our research partners in countries, but also the movements themselves. So we did have movements that we approached who said, no, we can't do this, but these were the movements who also understood, what we were trying to do, and as I said, let us in, and that was really important. Our methods have been that of mixed methods, mainly qualitative and participatory. We've had a comparative case analysis approach, where we've had in-depth work with each of those cases, with about 20 interviews at least, with members, with leaders, with allies, focus group discussions on 2 issues, one on sort of like their social networks, one on power analysis in each of the struggles. And this really is complemented by our analytical methodology of qualitative comparative analysis, which really seeks to analyze these cases together, again, to find the factor that really leads to success. And a lot of our findings will be about that. We also did longitudinal qualitative data through struggle diaries, which basically involved interviewing a core group of members or leaders per case. And then we had at least one reflective workshop, and we had a taster of that reflective workshop yesterday for those who were able to attend in person. But this methodology is basically based on the theater of the oppressed, and uses forum theater as a way to elicit strategies and to really go on a journey with the struggles. So that's what we were able to do. And I'm going to hand over very quickly to Priya to present the first of three levels of findings, which is on theorizing backlash. And then Samreen will talk about how women's movements have been affected by this backlash. And then I'll come back to think about more about the strategies and what works to really advance gender justice. So over to you, Priya.
Thanks so much. So as Deepta says, the first set of contributions that this project makes is really around the question of how do we conceptually and theoretically approach backlash as a phenomenon. There is increasingly consensus in the literature that backlash is a defining political condition of our times, but there's much less agreement on what precisely backlash is. Rowley, Marib, and others have increasingly pointed to how practices of disembodied macro-scale abstraction are quite pervasive now within backlash literature. And this comes at the cost of more granular anthropological accounts that really attend to the experiences and perspectives of those at the margins. So through SuPWR, that is precisely the gap that we're trying to address, where we arrive at a conceptualization of what backlash is by attending to how it is experienced and narrated by those who are most affected by it. So tracing specific vocabularies of backlash in South Asia, we make the case for understanding it as a series of events or hostile encounters that attach themselves to the tentacles of everyday life. And in this work, we're grounded in anti-colonial feminist epistemologies, and especially the work of Veena Das, to characterize backlash then as both structure and event. And in this framework, or through it, we're hoping to resolve some of the most enduring debates within backlash literature. And those are on three main themes. The first is around the temporality of backlash. Is it episodic? Is it continuous, or both? Is it necessarily retrogressive? Does it always point towards or nostalgic for patriarchal past, or is it also pointing towards idealized patriarchal futures? The second level of debates is around constitutive and oppositional subjects. Who are the backlash and anti-backlash actors, and can they really be so neatly disaggregated? And finally, there's also enduring debates on how backlash can best be understood as unfolding alongside and interacting with a range of other retrogressive projects, some of which Anu mentioned in her opening, but also needs to be recognized as distinct from that. And that's something Samreen's going to come back to in her section. Another central conceptual offering from this project, and this one really has significant effects for the politics of backlash and resisting it, and that's our finding that backlash is not necessarily or inevitably experienced as disabling. It's not always destructive of feminist and queer collectives and politics. In fact, backlash is often narrated as generative or productive. So quite unexpectedly, we found through our movements that difficulty delivers durability rather than just dissipation or destruction. Activists share experiences and memories of how violent repression served as affective glue for their movements, as fuel to their collective fire, as Bhagwati said yesterday. And it engenders politicized subjectivities, cohesive collectives, and resistive possibilities. So in the words of one of our activists from the Nepal squatter women's movement, if there is no struggle, there is no triumph. We also had an activist from the Bharatiya Muslim Mahila Andolan talk about how, in fact, within this landscape of backlash, it isn't necessarily resource crunches or even violence or threats of violence that are the most significant challenge movements face, but it is despair and hopelessness. And so against this backdrop, a generative reading of backlash, and one that recenters a politics of hope, is a really remarkable lesson from the activists and movements that we worked with. We also learned that in South Asia, much like in the rest of the world, backlash takes a range of forms, from more overt attacks or gender bashing, violence and threats of violence, to subtler forms, co-option or gender washing, the appropriation of elements of gender justice idioms and metaphors in order to advance all sorts of reactionary projects. And this, of course, then chimes with, but also offers further empirical grounding in the South Asian context to emerging literature on both backlash and anti-genderism transnationally. Finally, and once more, this finding is also consonant with some of the transnational literature, we were reminded forcefully time and again that the costs and effects of backlash are not uniformly borne. Backlash has differential effects for differently located subjects. Within South Asia, which is a landscape long marked by hierarchies of not just gender, but of course caste, class, ethnicity, religion, and even age, anti-gender backlash is sustained through practices of othering. And so it must be understood and challenged intersectionally in interaction with a range of other retrogressive projects like ethno and religious nationalisms, coloniality, racial capitalism. But that said, it is also important to isolate and analyze anti-gender backlash as distinct from these because of its very specific forms and effects in relation to gender. And that's something Samreen is going to pick up on now. Please.
Thanks, Priya. And in continuation with what Priya said, what the project has also focused on, and what I'll spend some time talking about now, is what backlash has done to collective organizing and how women's movements experience and reflect on this experience. What our work shows is how the availability of space for women's movements really varies with the nature of political and social contestation. So in terms of configurations of party systems, political parties in power and their narratives, the variations in secular and religious influences, but also on a more local level, the influence of family and community in terms of whether they open up space for women's rights or whether they are more constraining than the state and the nationalist project. And therefore, this has implications regarding the acceptability of themes on women's rights at the local level, but it's also telling of how the space is not similarly constrained for differently placed subjects or even different agendas within the women's rights discourse more broadly. And in relation to this, what the project also brings forth is basically the distinct vulnerability for movements that are constituted of and by the very subaltern subjects for whom they're advocating and about whom these movements are really speaking about. And it is these collectives that face backlash, especially in the form of stigmatization and delegitimization. But as Priya also said, equally, it is the composition of these movements that is also central to the possibilities of collective resistance against this backlash. Because it is these shared experiences and collective experiences of backlash that become precisely the conditions that sort of produce cohesive, durable, and resistive collective subaltern identities. What we've also learned closely related to this is in terms of cooperation with the mainstream women's movement for these marginalized groups, it often involves a trade-off between, say, on one hand, access to wider platforms, closed policy spaces, and on the other hand, sort of submerging of their agenda under the broader agendas or strategic invisibility. And so these movements are always contending with these strategic choices in order to assert and reassert their intersectional identities and feminisms. What the project has shown us from working with different movements is that exchanges between the broader feminist movement on one hand and these marginalized groups, it is often like one-off, in many instances, very tokenistic, and really mostly just involves participation in events and trainings rather than really sharing of material and discursive resources. In terms of how women's movements really experience this backlash, the effects of it really extend in and across time. One, because of the enduring effects of specific historical encounters with violence, but two, also because of the ways in which an anticipation of this violence really shapes activists' imaginations, lives, and choices in the here and now. So activists who sort of primarily engage in street-based protests as a strategy to counter backlash are ever alert to this looming threat of possible repression, potential arrests, and charges after these events. So these prospects of brutality and carcerality really centrally and constantly mark the ways activists engage and how movements strategize in the face of this backlash. And this is especially true because anti-gender backlash is experienced in ways that really permeates every register and realm of activists' intimate and public lives. Across all 4 countries, activists time and again spoke of the violence, the control, and coercion that they faced within the supposedly safe space of the domestic as a result of their direct association with and work in these movements. And so what this tells us is that the fundamental inescapability of gender is also sort of reflected in this inescapability of the gender backlash, which follows activists even in the realm of their intimate lives. And this is what, as Priya earlier mentioned, really sets it slightly distinct from other forms of backlash that in relation to other identity-based struggles, where activists who are sort of whose movements are rooted in anti-caste or struggles around race, really they do find home as the site of constant support, solidarity, and shared community. But for women in these struggles, home is not really a site of refuge, and their gendered identities and subordination are not realities that they can really readily shed at the threshold as sort of they enter this purportedly safe space. And so last point, again, in relation to this, what we've seen is in South Asia, as elsewhere, there's a distinct, and diverse set of actors who are engaged in anti-gender backlash, ranging from individuals, institutions, and collectives. However, activists across all the 4 countries expressed that what they felt most sharply and what hurt them most intimately was this backlash coming from less anticipated and more effectively proximate sources. So, for example, the broader left or the feminist movement more broadly, the communities in which these activists work, or even the collectives that these activists themselves are a part of, which is especially challenging given the pervasive cultures of silence that mark conversations around fractures and fissures within collectives. But just to conclude, despite these multi-sided struggles and ongoing challenges and this brutal onslaught of backlash that we are seeing, movements do find ways to engage productively with it to propel themselves forward, which is what Deepta will now take forward. Thank you.
In a very concise fashion.
So to me falls the task of giving you talking about strategies in a concise manner, which is basically the whole project. Okay, so basically what and I'm not going through the list of strategies. That's not the point. The point is to figure out the commonalities. So really, first commonality is that these movements are continuously adapting, and they're continuously being flexible, assessing risks, assessing gains, where it's worth engaging and where actually strategic invisibility is what they want to do to hold the line. They also have selective collaborations and very pragmatic choices, which are critical to minimizing the violence and the threats of violence that they face. In all of this, actually, the discursive domain is quite central in the sense of like, and we heard yesterday how, instead of land rights, NMES talks about urban poor. So kind of like the shift in sort of like, language is quite important. The second big finding that's common across all these strategies is that these struggles are continuously seeking allies. They're seeking accomplices even within compromised institutions, especially the state, but also like, employer and employee associations and, and community leaders, etc. And they are identifying and mobilizing what we call affective opportunity structures in the sense of using emotions, using art, using creative methods to secure broader support for their cause and expanding the membership base. We also found that intersectional solidarities are key. They are complex, but they are key both in terms of like, different issues, but also different generations. And the more important aspect that all struggles expressed to us was the need for spaces of reflection, of interrogation, of building enduring solidarities by just resting and repairing, rather than just sort of like, practical, this is how we collaborate, etc. So practices and processes of care become very, very important. And care, we are framing as in two different papers, as one is as social love, which becomes political and collective and generates and activates community building processes. But also, there are these diffused webs of care, and we're using Toronto and Fisher, but also extending both to kind of really think about movements as requiring care as both a necessary and sufficient condition of being movements. And we heard somebody say to us that, if it is not, if there is no care in a movement, it's not a movement, it's an organization. And so care acts as a magnet to bring people together, but also as a glue to keep people together. And so care in women's movements is more than just duties and roles and emotional responsibilities and bonds, but it's actually diverse, it's dispersed, and it's collective praxis. Okay, so these are like, in a nutshell, the findings. Where are we going from here? We've got a lot of work that has already come out. We have 9 short films that are up on our website, and Leah will send a link to those of you who are online, and also let's put it up on each, and there's many photo stories as well. There's a visual exhibition, photo exhibition that we took online and had also brought to each of the countries. We have an animation, and the stills from where you're seeing these are actually part of the animation, which you will see at the end of our paired discussions. We have 4 articles coming in contemporary South Asia, and an introduction, which is hopefully due in December 2026, and 8 other journal articles in multiple stages, as well as a co-authored book. But looking ahead then, what we really want is to think about this as a continuous engagement and working with these incredible movements and women around South Asia in a way that can project their stories much beyond the life of this project, because the project formally comes to an end. But we really want this data to be used for newer insights, for research policy practice, we want to encourage the cases themselves to publish, to write, to document. We want to also think about methods, as we talked about, especially the reflective methods, which have already been used by some of the movements, to actually also used by other research projects and also by activists themselves. And this is a quote that one of the movements in Pakistan, the Hazara women, really gave, which is something that is so important to the ethos and the whole findings of this project. And and this is my last slide, is kind of saying that joining forces with other marginalized communities is like building a big, strong wall against injustice. So movements want to, like, come together, but it's also not just about standing up to injustice, it's also tearing that wall of injustice down brick by brick. So movements are continuing to define the terms of the debate. They are using backlash generatively, even in the harshest of settings. And we'll find that in the country dialogues as well. But it is very crucial that this fight is well resourced, that it is strengthened by transnational solidarities. And we really want to have these resources directed not necessarily at research, but actually at the movements themselves. And research and documentation then forms a part of this ongoing struggle against backlash. So I will stop here. Thanks, Anu, and I'm really sorry for the time.
So I was doing very straightforward. Thank you, Deepta. I mean, it seems like this project is so rich with so many findings. Oops, what happened? This project is so rich with so many findings, and I can see echoes of some of the findings that resonate with social movements elsewhere that are not about gender. But I think what's really interesting is that there are some findings about, say, care that might be useful for other social movements and that highlight and bring to surface some of these things. So we now move on to the conversations, the paired conversations between in-country researchers and our colleagues here. And we start with Pakistan. So over to you, Shandana.
Gary, I was wondering if we could focus, sort of pin Mariam on this. Oh, okay, excellent. Okay, thank you. Okay, so we'll now get into a lot more detail on what all of my colleagues have been talking about the strategies that have been used, but also the very different contexts. And a lot of this, I imagine, will draw on the special issue that Deepta mentioned. We've brought 4 country papers together for this. Those papers, to some extent, confirm what's happening in each country as similarities. In other cases, they point out these very deep differences that exist within the South Asian region. So this is our opportunity then to really think through that in a little bit more detail for each of these countries. The way we set this up is we ask each other a few questions across each of the IDS researchers on this and the country leads in each country that led this research. I'm going to start with my colleague, Mariam Khan. Mariam was trained, is a fellow at IDEAS, which helped us anchor this project in Pakistan. Mariam was trained as a lawyer and since then has gone on to also train through her PhD as on constitutional history. And so my first question to her is really with that in mind is, Mariam, as a scholar of Pakistan's constitutional and political history, how would you define the context within which we studied women, the struggles for women's rights? You there, Mariam? No, I think we might have lost. Oops.
Hello, everybody. I'm not sure if you can hear me because my screen is frozen.
You could put your video off, Mariam. That might help with the sound, and then maybe try again in a few minutes to put it back on. But go ahead and speak. We can hear you, it seems. Have we lost you entirely? Okay. Okay. I'm just wondering if I can tell you a little bit more about each of the papers in the meantime. But yeah, let's wait for her to come back. Yeah.
I think you can tell us a little bit more.
Apologies,
I'm just
everyone.
wondering if there's a question in the meantime. Yeah.
She's back.
Okay. Mariam, did you
Apologies.
hear me? And did you hear my question to you?
I'm off because clearly my internet is quite unstable. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes. You know the first question that I've...
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
That's my voice. That is volume, not theirs. Yeah. Okay. Yes, go ahead, Mariam.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I hope it's not an ominous sign that I went offline just as I was asked the question. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. Very pleased to be here and just, carrying forward from what has already been said. In terms of Pakistan's context for these particular struggles, of course, the broader context is defined as authoritarian and patriarchal and hostile. And we've already noted how the broader global trajectories are moving towards greater autocratization and right-wing politics. And of course, Pakistan certainly fits within that larger shift. But at the same time, there are some distinctive aspects which really have a very consequential impact, if you will, for the struggles that we were observing within Pakistan. Broadly, the timeline arc for studying our struggles, as you know, was starting somewhere between the mid 2000s, extending all the way up to the contemporary moment. Of course, some of the struggles that we looked at were younger than others, but this is broadly the window of a decade and a half, almost 2 decades in one particular case that we were looking at. And I wanted to posit that a very constructive way of looking at the contextual background in Pakistan is really to think of moments of expansion and contraction of both political and civic spaces for women's political participation and representation more broadly, but also for their organizing and mobilizing around specific issues of women's rights. And we see a number of variations and a lot of diversity, in fact, in terms of how this expansion and contraction works. And I want to help us think through what those contextual factors look like. So I identified 2 broadly. One of them is the very high political volatility within which social movements operate within Pakistan, and particularly women's movements. And the second contextual factor was what we've seen in more recent decades, a diversification in the state or the institutional structure that these movements have to engage with. So what do I mean by these 2? You must have heard the term hybrid regime being used in the context of Pakistan, and that has been defined as a kind of an electoral autocracy. So we have all the sort of infrastructural tools that mimic democracy, but of course the broader structure that sustains the state is military power. And so whether you have an elected government or a military government, there's oftentimes an authoritarian backdrop to both those configurations and a lot of repression. And so that is what makes Pakistan rather complex, because even when you're looking at this broad trajectory from, let's say, the mid 2000s, when there was a military dictator in place, there was a lot of emphasis on women's political participation. But by the time we come to 2015, we see quite a bit of an erosion of that, even though the decade preceding that is supposedly an elected representative government that comes about through an electoral transition in 2008. So we see these very complex things happening. We do have a fallout of the war on terror, 2015 onwards, where we see the military's influence resurging in state institutions, the resurgence of a security state, clamp down on civil society, right-wing influence peaking at that time. But it's also interesting to note that prior to the electoral transition, we had a military regime which was actively promoting women's rights. But with the electoral transition, we saw a slow and steady erosion of democratic values and institutions. And that just makes the situation extremely volatile and unpredictable for women's struggles on the ground, who have to be very quick, have to be extremely innovative, to find spaces and moments and structures that can actually lead quite unpredictably to unexpected gains. And so remaining on their feet and constantly engaging with this very rapidly evolving political landscape. So that was one. And the other very interesting contextual factor is how the national sort of configuration of the state starting from 2010 onwards, roughly, was diversified in such a way that politics and political parties became very sort of regionalized. What I mean by that is that most of the political activity in terms of political outcomes for social movements have become determined by devolution of power from the national level to the provincial governments. And so you find a situation where there was a lot of pro-women's legislation happening in the early 2000s. And by the time you hit 2010 and this devolution of power happens, provincial governments realize that they will have to re-legislate on a lot of these issues at the provincial level in order for those laws and especially pro-women's laws to apply to women in those specific regions. So there's regional differentiation, which coincided with the regionalization of political parties as well, so that they became more limited to their sort of provincial regions, meant that women's movements had to respond to this sort of diversification. And a lot of them that were networked at the national level now had to kind of try and fit their agendas and their sort of politics around the province or the region. So there you can imagine there was a lot of diversification in terms of the kinds of institutions and institutional actors that they would have to face and engage with, the kinds of political parties that they would have to engage, the lobbying that they would have to do with specific groups, and the kinds of allies and coalitional partners that they would have to look for in order to have their voices heard. So these are the two really important contextual factors which I think were really important in the way in which these movements came to be structured and how they went ahead with their strategic action. So I think I'm going to stop over there. And over to you, Shandana. I want to ask you, given this particular context, this broad context that I've laid out, what changes have you seen in these strategies of women's struggles within Pakistan over the time of the project? And given this context, what do you think are the differences between the struggles we've studied in Pakistan and those elsewhere?
Thank you, Mariam, for setting up that context so well. And there's multiple mics at work here. And I think we spent a lot of time thinking about that through the project across all of the 16 struggles that we were looking at across the 4 countries. And I know we thought about it a lot while writing the Pakistan paper, because we were constantly, wow, we have 5 minutes to go, but let me just sort of bring this together quickly, is that we thought a lot about what is it that's different here. And I think picking up, moving quickly to what you said, Mariam, is that in each case, there's real similarities that we'll hear a lot about today, about the ways in which these movements constantly adapt to backlash. And the various multiple forms in which they're engaging with it. I think the added factor, as you said, Mariam, in Pakistan's case, is that at the same time, they are also adapting to political instability and constantly changing actors, attitudes, and behaviors. There's not just changes of government, which are very frequent, but also changes of regime. These are between military rule and civilian, to a great extent. I'm not going to say democracy, but civilian governments that come into play. And as Mariam pointed out, one of those big differences is that it messes up what we know from theory about this. Theory tells us that more democratic regimes will help open up the space for women's rights. In Pakistan, it's worked the other way around. Military dictatorships, the dictatorship of General Musharraf, is where they really found that space. In other moments, there are particular parties, such as the Pakistan People's Party, which will open up space. But those spaces move very rapidly. They can close down, they can open, they can close. Even in other regimes, movements manage to open up space, but how they do it has really been the subject of our study. So where we came to in all of this was trying to understand Pakistan out of the four, I think, as a particularly hostile setting, and trying to understand how these movements did this, because what we found was really fascinating, is that each one of these movements we would consider as really successful. And this is news to the movements as well, I think, is when we say you've been incredibly successful. And the reason why we think about that is you're dealing with this kind of a setting, but what you have managed in each case is to make yourselves heard to the extent where the governments, various governments and actors and institutions have realized at different points that their legitimacy almost depends on picking up on this issue and passing some laws and changing some of those institutional ways of dealing with it. And the backlash is severe. It goes all the way from violence in the streets against women's marches, such as the Aurat March, to refusing them almost on an annual basis, whether or not they can get the certificate that they need to go out and do that, to the movement that Mariam was dealing with, where the government repeatedly sent laws against child marriages to where they knew it would stop, the Council of Islamic Ideology. They knew it would go and sort of the bill would die there, to sort of deliberate lack of implementation when laws do get passed. So bureaucracy is refusing to step in. So the backlash has been there, and yet in each case, we have been able to record really incredible moments of each one of these struggles having achieved what they set out to in some kinds of legal changes, in some kinds of having their voices heard. So to me, what it has said through this is that I want to think, I think the Pakistan case, and we'll hear from the others soon, the Pakistan case really tells us that they're resisting to some extent, but what they've really been doing is not just resisting to backlash, they've actually been setting the terms of this debate. And in that sense, that's, Mariam, we have a short while left, and I wanted to ask you very quickly that if we say that, what are the strategies that have really helped them in doing that? So we say they've been adaptive, they've been diverse, but if you can just give us a few quick examples of how they've really done that.
Thank you so much, Chandana. Yeah, absolutely. So I just want to once again, just a prefatory comment, picking up on what Chandana was saying about success. And I think it's really important to say here what Deepta also laid out earlier regarding this study, the fact that success was defined in, actual sort of conversation with what these struggles would want to see for themselves as their strategic objectives and how they were being achieved. So success also, in other words, not just reactive in terms of how well backlash is addressed, but also very actively shaping their own discourses over a period of time and navigating through, once again, difficult circumstances to really go for a longer term, a change in mindset, belief, leveraging all sorts of things along the way. So in that sense, yes, the success seems incredible, even though struggle actors themselves might express a certain level of despondency and fatigue. I think what we were trying to bring home to them was that their strategic action was actually working. So three big things. One, of course, when we think of strategic adaptation, we're obviously thinking about a passage of time where we're observing how their repertoires of action are changing episodically. They start from a position of situatedness within a configuration which is defined both by the broader context and who these actors actually are. And then over a period of time, we see how those repertoires of action are actually becoming diversified in terms of the arenas of contestation which are being targeted, whether they're institutional or street protest based, and various other ways. So their tactics down to the very sort of granular details of how the movement itself has to be structured and restructured and reorganized in order to meet certain forms of backlash and threats. So there's this entire sort of interesting spectrum of what we mean by adaptation. And then secondly, of course, the really crucial finding for why these struggles succeed was the fact that their strategic action was really well thought out. It was very specifically and directly tailored to backlash. And even if it meant movements and struggle actors retreating momentarily to really think through whether or not their strategies were working and what would need to do in terms of re-strategizing and building resilience, those forms of or moments of retreat were also a kind of a re-strategization, which was really important. But what really made these struggles distinctive was the fact that they were able to come back. And so they were building resilience over a period of time. They were not necessarily expecting overnight gains. They understood that this was a struggle for the long haul. So that was really crucial. And the third really important thing was the emphasis on the change in discourse. So most of these struggles were not focused entirely or solely on questions of policy and legal reform, which is where a lot of literature, I think, sits. But they were quite mindful of the fact that an entire intellectual or discursive foundation of the issues that they were talking about had to be changed, had to evolve over time in order for certain institutional actors or the state itself to come to a position where even where the state's objectives didn't align with the movements, they would eventually have to, act in a way that was aligned
we're going to
with the
stop
movements
there,
themselves.
Mariam. Thank you. And I think
Thank you.
the centrality of discourse is going to be picked up in some of the other cases as well. Thank you, Mariam.
Thank you, Mariam and Shantana. We next go to Nepal. Priya, you're starting this conversation.
Thanks. So I'm going to be in conversation with Mona Sherpa. Mona is the country director of CARE Nepal and is a long-term member of the women's movement in Nepal and a full-time inspiration. She's led the amazing team from Nepal that conducted the research there, and which included Sujina ji, who's here with us today, and hopefully a lot of the other team are online. So always a treat to be in conversation with you, Mona ji. Can you start by telling us a bit about the challenges confronting women's movements in Nepal, specifically over the past 5-6 years?
Thank you, Priya. You are a dear friend as well, along with Deepta and the entire IGS team, with whom I had amazing years of engagement, and I'm really thankful for that. On your question, I would say having worked with feminist movements and activists for many years, I can say that the past 5 years has been very inspiring and deeply sobering as well. What stands out most clearly from the super research, as that was what we were engaging in this last 5 years, is the amount of challenges these struggle face, the movement faces. It often feels like onslaught is relentless, with almost no space for rest and recovery. And I heard even Mariam, mentioning that earlier. The first and the most visible challenge, I would say, comes from state. The very institution which is meant to protect its citizen. Instead, activists are met with police harassment, surveillance, intimidations, and women living in informal or land poor settlements as squatters. They face repeated threats of eviction and their basic rights. From citizenship to housing to dignified, working space for them. And that was constantly undermined by the state. The state presents many times itself as a protector, but in reality, many activists, they experience it as a primary source of coercion and fear too. Second, I would say, there is a less, this second one is less visible but equally painful challenge. And we also talked about it yesterday, which comes from within the broader, dominant feminist movement itself. These are spaces meant to be safe, supportive, and very solidaristic. However, often they are not. And that's why it's very painful. Women organizing from the margins, like squatter communities, adolescent girls resisting child marriage, or women in highly stigmatized or informal, sectors, they frequently face dismissal or judgment or even a conditional solidarity. So their agendas are mostly sidelined, their leadership is questioned, and especially if they are young, they are treated as somebody who needs guidance but can't lead. And thus, I often say, I'm sure like all the super team has heard, you have also heard it, Priya. I often say that what's the point of claiming solidarity if that solidarity is not solid? The third player or third layer of backlash that came, it was very like from very which was very closer, like families and communities, especially the young girls in the girls' rights forum. They shared how they were stigmatized simply because they were traveling from one district to another for the meetings, for the gatherings, the collective actions. They were threatened by their families, their neighbors, their own fathers, brothers, and that's sad. And they were accused of inappropriate behaviors, simply because they stayed overnight outside for these collective work, for their activism, for the movement. And this tells how deeply that norm about control, the purity, the mobility, it continues to shape their lives. And finally, Super helped us also to see, backlash isn't only external, because many times we felt like backlash is external, it's coming from state, it's coming from market, family, community, but then as I said earlier, it also came from the broader the dominant feminist movement itself as well, and which was very painful too. It very much exists within the movement themselves, and many collective struggles with the concentration of power, where sadly the leader themselves become larger than the cause, and the leadership transitions are fraught. Handing over these positions is very easy, I would say, but handing over those experience, those wisdom, those network, those connections is not. And without those kind of internal or very intentional structure for this, the younger leaders are undermined, dismissed, as I also said earlier, especially the leaders from the Girls' Rights Forum, they really faced it. And even from the movement like Nepal and Pakistan, the squatters movement, they risk and by repeating this, I would say they risk repeating the same hierarchies that they set out to dismantle. So all these layers, as I said, from the state, from the dominant movement, the feminist movement itself, family, communities, and from within the collectives, actually, it really appears together in our usual definition of backlash. But for the women, and then those women's struggle that we worked together with for 5 years, this is their everyday reality that they confront.
Thanks, Monaji. It is really quite stark and sobering to hear those multiple levels of backlash laid out, and especially those ones that are closest to home and often feel most piercing. And yet, as we know, despite all of these considerable and mounting challenges, we've seen there is remarkable and in some ways even renewed or redoubled determination to come together in the face of all of this and to fight for and demand better lives and a better world. So can you tell us a bit more about what makes that possible, specifically in the Nepali context? What did you see were the conditions of possibility that made movements, that enabled movements to come together in the face of all of this?
Yes, exactly. As you said, Priya, it was the most remarkable, and as I also said earlier, very humbling, experience. And throughout the research that we witnessed, how even in the harshest conditions, these struggles, determination to come together was not weakened, but it was strengthened, and we noticed it. From day one to day, by the end of the day five, year 5, how they were stronger, together in their effort. In fact, one of our core supers, learnings was that the backlash can sometimes become generative. And I heard Samreen, Deepta, and even you, mentioning that earlier. It becomes fuel. Exactly as you said, and yesterday Bhagwati was also mentioning that it became that a fire around which movement they gathered and fortified themselves. So movement like Nepal Mahila Ekta Samaj and Jagriti Mahila Masang, they have what I noticed is that they have this very depth of cohesion that is very rare and powerful. Their unity is not, built on only shared slogans or these abstract ideologies and jargons. It very much comes from the shared histories of pain, shared experiences of exclusion, that shared courage to resist, to stand, for themselves. And we noticed it. Their collective identity is very much rooted on their lived, struggle, pain. And yesterday, when Bhagwati was sharing that in the workshop, it almost made me, cry. Because that is something which I felt and I noticed when I was working with them along with our Nepal, research team. When I would also like to share this, that when there was a one, woman, a member from Nepal Mahila Ekta Samaj, she secured her land ownership certificate, and but she didn't leave the movement. And when we had a conversation with her, she stayed, and we asked her, why, and she insisted, and she said that, she will only stop uh, calling herself Sukumbasi. Sukumbasi means like squatter in Nepali. Uh, Only when, all of them have land. And that shows the profound sense of interdependence, the belief that one person's liberation means little if, her sisters remain vulnerable. So that interdependence, that trust, that collective collectivized effort, that connection, that is also something, I think, that helped them. Similarly, women are navigating very highly stigmatized sectors, like from entertainment sector, from Jagriti Mahila, JMMS. It also showed extraordinary solidarity with the message that they are not the part of a rescue narrative, which many of the mainstream feminist movement do, but then they are organizing for their rights, their dignity, and for their recognition. And that strength, it comes from the fact that they themselves know what the struggle feels like. In Nepali we say jasko sawal usko agwai usko bhogai, means they have lived that life, they have felt that pain, they know their struggle, they have lived it, and thus their fight is also to come together for their dignity, for their recognition, and their leadership is also lived, not projected onto them. And beyond this internal strength, we saw the transformative also power of alliance. When movement met each other, all those four struggles that I spoke of earlier, there was a real excitement, real curiosity, the generous are very genuine, how to say that, desire to support each other's agenda. They shared strategies, they lifted each other's voice, they were genuinely there to discover new possibilities for collective action, which was amazing, and power to come together. And I felt like it was a very transformative and very energizing as well. And finally, what I would also like to tell is what was very absolutely essential, were also the spaces of healing and that embodied reflection. And I know, when Bhagwati was talking about 3 C's yesterday, one of her C's was also on this, the collective care. And I would say that the reflective workshop, the theater-based workshop, that as a methodology, which Deepta was also mentioning, it allowed these struggles and activists, each members, to process their pain, their trauma, their joy, their exhaustion, their experiences, even their hope, in the way that words alone could not. And these spaces became the spaces for laughter, for play, for movement, for release, despite the pain that they were going through, despite the backlash they were facing. And activists didn't just understand each other's struggle, they internalized it, they felt them. And many told us, during that whole process, that they had been really thirsting for this kind of connection. So this combination of, I would say, deep collective identity, interdependencies, the alliance, the safe spaces for healing, the reflection, that made their resistance possible even in the darkest times. I saw someone's question in the chat section also. So I would say that they were really able to politically stay bold because their politics, it was based on the lived experiences, not just the donor agendas, not just agenda that was given to them by anyone else. They stay bold, or they could resist all those backlash with different tactics because they were building their internal strength so that they do not collapse when the funding or any thing or the politics changes. By navigating the duality of the state without becoming loyal to it alone, there were so many such kind of strategies that they used. Even Bhagwati was talking about reframing their politics, using this politics of reframing, then the neutrality. So yeah, those sort of things. But then Priya, as I said, you stayed with us throughout, day in, day out, along with our ideas team. You worked very closely with us, along with other researchers. This forum theater, this reflective workshop, it was very amazing to bring them together. And that, I think, became the transformative power, as I said earlier. Can you share a bit about that and tell us why the research project used this method? Because I think it is something interesting for everyone to know.
Thanks, Mona. I've just been told we have a minute left, so I'm going to do this very quickly and then back over to you. But yeah, I think it was a really central part of the project design, and it was something that our amazing colleagues Effie Makepeace and Akshay Khanna designed for the project, and it drew on tools and methods from Augusto Boal's Theatre of the Oppressed, with this idea that quite often embodied tools, and especially theatre, can become what he calls a rehearsal for the revolution. And the rationale behind this for the project was that, as we know, especially a lot of gendered and affective knowledge lives in bodies. It isn't so easily articulable. It cannot very easily be surfaced through interviews and focus group discussions. And so the idea was to have a space to collectively access, process, and make sense of these embodied forms of knowledge. So a very quick final line, Mona, I'm so sorry. I'm going to ask you just a last question on what contemporary developments in Nepal mean, especially in terms of the recent student uprising and regime change. What does that mean for sexual and gender justice? If you could just give us a quick line or two, that would be amazing.
Oh, Nepal is going through lots of changes. Definitely historical moment, an interesting one too. At least the way it resulted, it reminded all of us of the the power of collective mobilization. And good to see that the younger generation are taking ownership of the political direction of the country. However, there is always however. We have to be cautious, in our optimism also, because the leaders who have come through the process, they also have their own history. The main thing is whether they have, emphasized the social agendas, the agendas of the margin or not, the rights issue or not, the issues that the movement has carried on for quite some time, that is there or not. So that is something that we need to look into. So I would say the question is not simply, is this a new era? Rather it must be, what does the new era hold? It means for the women and girls at the ages of society. Will there be will their lives, become safer, more dignified, more secure or not? And as, this is where I really want to take the philosophy of Nepal Mahila Ekta Samaj, as I shared earlier. None of us are free until all of us are free. So we need to see, that is the principle that we need to carry forward. And in resisting this backlash, there is a possibility, but we need to be watchful so that we build alliance, and it helps us in imagining the Nepal we want to build for social justice. A lot to watch, and see whether it centers the margin or not.
Thanks so much, Mona. Thank you. And now
thank you, Mona and Priya. And sorry to try and condense everybody, but this is just the beginning of the conversation. And, these issues can be taken up in the Q&A and also later. So over to India, Deepta.
Thank
you.
You.
Leading.
Yeah, thanks, Anu. So I just wanted to introduce our India program lead, Mubashira, Zaidi. Mubashira is a research fellow and program lead at the Institute of Social Studies Trust, a very dear friend, and we have a very long history of collaboration that goes much before this project itself. I think Mubashira and I met literally during the first month of my joining IDS. So I with Ratna at that point leading, being the director of ISST. So a very long collaboration and really amazing to have you here, Mubashira. And I really wanted to ask you, again, with, I mean, it's not a massive political change, but a slow erosion of rights and growing authoritarianism and closing of civic space in India, and also an othering of minorities, right? So there's not that much engagement with the state. So what strategies do these struggles use to counter this othering? If you could let us know a little bit about that.
Thanks a lot, Deepta, for the introduction. And I really hope this collaboration between ISST and IDS continues. And thank you for the question. In our experience through this project, we've seen that the phenomenon of backlash against women's movements in India, especially in the present socio-political circumstances, has manifested as identity-based processes of othering through the production of various us and them categories, which is not limited to gender alone. But intersectional identity markers such as caste, class, ethnicity, and religion. In the four movements in India, we see the primary identities along with gender that became the basis of othering were somewhat distinct. In case of Bharatiya Muslim Mahila Andolan, it was the identity of the Muslim women. For Samarkand Mahila Sangathan, it was the experience of belonging to oppressed caste identities. Kotra Adivasi Vikas Manch, it was the Adivasi identity. And for Community for Social Change and Development, as we heard yesterday, was about being a paid domestic worker. The struggles strategize in different ways to counter backlash that formed like a continuum, where at one end we see capitalization of the identity that is being othered, and at the other end is the rejection of othering, and in between of resistance. To give some examples, in case of capitalization, we find that the identity itself is not resisted. Instead, what is contested is its devaluation. This reframing underscores exclusion, but also boosts the credibility of claiming rights and asking justice. For instance, in the case of Adivasi women in Rajasthan, who are viewed as welfare subjects or forest encroachers, for reframing, her reframing is accompanied by a conscious access to public political spaces, particularly the use of Gaon Sabhas at hamlet level to cultivate Adivasi women's leadership and decision-making roles, to claim traditional rights of Adivasis over jungle zameen. So in case of SMS, we see that the figure of interfering lowered caste woman who does not have the right to intervene in community instances of violence against women is reframed into that of a legitimate justice actor through their participation in Nyaya Samitis. We also see capitalization working through the strategy of normalization through certain routine practices by the movements, making their presence and claims and authority increasingly commonplace and expected. Again, if you look at Adivasi Manch, women's political participation was institutionalized through calendared, regular, recurring spaces. A women's convention, for instance, is organized every year where at least 100 to 150 women come and participate. Similarly, Nyaya Samitis follow clearly defined standard operating procedures rather than episodic intervention. Sharia adalats of BMMA function as a routine and trusted forum. We also, in fact, see strategic essentialism of identities in operation. Here, for instance, CSCD operated through aggregation and highlighting scale of domestic workers, paid domestic workers. The internal diversity of workers is temporarily suspended. They're conscious of that, recognize it, but it is suspended in favor of a unified, accountable identity that can be made legible to policymakers. At the other end of the continuum is refusal and rejection of this other identity. And there is a call for being treated as citizens of the country rather than a special category. In between, we see a range of resistance strategies. One important strategy here is building counter institutions, such as women-led justice forums of Nyaya Samiti and Auraton Ki Sharia Adalat. The Adalat then becomes no longer a space where women appear in front of, appear as petitioners before male clerics, but it is a space governed by women qazis, and on women's terms. Among other strategies, we also had non-engagement. We heard yesterday Noor Jahan from Bama speaking about their decision to disengage from the dominant feminist organizations that were seen as opposed to their idea of engaging with Islam. But they also disengaged with conservative religious bodies. We also saw withdrawal of in case of KM, withdrawal from a strategy that was long used in electoral politics. So while the movement initially encouraged women candidates to contest as independents to challenge party dominance, changing political terrain and repeated losses revealed elections to be dominated by money and muscle power. So KM therefore withdrew from independent contests and began collaborating directly with political parties, which was a very difficult decision for them. But because of the changing times, they had to withdraw from the earlier strategy. But just to conclude, what's important to note is that none of the movements occupy a single position. Instead, they move across this continuum, often combining strategies or shifting between them, depending on the political context, their capacities, and the risk of backlash. So when you're talking about strategies, Deepta, I wanted to understand from you, what are some of the strategies that you've observed or seen in other countries, and that which Indian women's struggles could learn from or adopt?
Thanks, Mubashir. And those strategies of resistance to co-optation, to, sorry, guys, to really resistance and not being one with, each of these, not being committed to one strategy. I mean, I think that's something that we can see across these struggles, in Pakistan and Nepal, and in Bangladesh, we'll see. I think the main challenges, I think, that the Indian struggles have to face is that of geography, in the terms of it's such a big country, different issues, different positions, and I think that but despite that, I think there is the need, and I think that other movements, especially in Nepal, we have seen this happen, about how there's a building of trust, there's a healing across divides, and there's that power of that collective, which also Bhagwati spoke about yesterday, and Mona spoke about today. And I think that's something that collective power with healing, with care, is something that we think, I really think that the Indian struggles could perhaps learn a little bit from. I think the other strategy, again, that a lot of the in fact some of the struggles in Pakistan, but also in Nepal, are showing, is the ability to move on the leadership. So kind of building a youth cadre of people, and that's something that the Indian struggles slightly sort of are not so easily transitioning through. So perhaps that youth transition might be something that is really important. But in terms of so coming back to, and it's a big question that we need to really ask the struggles themselves, is what have they learned? Because they've learned from each other. We've had a what do we call, a mega reflector workshop with about 52 people from these different struggles 2 or 3 people from each struggle coming together in Nepal, which is the only country, of course, that will give us visas, given the socio-economic and the political problems in the region. But, like what I really wanted to ask you is that what have you heard the struggles say about what their learnings have been during this project and how they're continuing these learnings?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really important question because we also keep an eye to keep reflecting on how is our research impacting movements. SuPWR has especially been interesting and special in that sense because it's been a longitudinal and engagement. A participatory nature of SuPWR project has created this unique space where researchers and activists could work closely and really understand each other's worlds. One of the first and the most important learnings from this has been the need for research, community, and practitioners to work in tandem if we are to make any meaningful dent in patriarchal and other discriminatory structures. For the women's struggles themselves, this process highlighted that research is not external to movements, but can actually strengthen them, especially when it is participatory and reflexive. So when we were talking about alliances, we also see this new alliance emerging from this long-term relationship of research and practice coming together in meaningful ways. Processes such as reflective workshops that we mentioned earlier, panel interviews, struggle diaries, became important spaces not just for data collection, but for building trust, for collective reflections and strengthening strategies on the ground. In fact, some of these methods that were used within the project were also adopted and adapted by the movements in their own organizing. For example, the use of forum theater has been taken forward by groups like BAMA, SMS, AVM within their communities. A second key learning has been around the importance of strengthening internal structures of the movements for supporting movement members themselves so as to sustain movements. The reflective tools that we used in the project created space for movements to think about these questions, such as, what strategies have been effective, or this is what you were mentioning just now. There is a strong realization across the 4 movements that we need to develop younger leadership. A second line of leadership is often absent in these movements. And equally, what are the different allies and the support systems that can be leveraged? This became especially significant in the period just after COVID-19 lockdown, when members were coming together for this research after a long gap and were dealing with personal and community level crisis. Another important area that emerged was around healing safety and security within movements that Mona was also mentioning. The project helped surface and strengthen existing processes of healing within women's struggles and brought attention to the need for ensuring safety and security of activists, especially in the context of backlash and crisis. For instance, Bama leaders were already engaged with mental health concerns. The leaders are professional healers. But through this process, there were discussions on continuing this with a renewed focus. In the case of SMS, during one of the reflective workshops, along with mental health concerns, issues of safety and security of workers emerged strongly. There was a forum theater that was built around this issue. This led to discussions on creating more collective and systematic mechanisms within the movement, building on what earlier were more informal and individual efforts. Also, wanted to highlight that in the case of CSCD, the research process itself became it played a direct role in supporting mobilization of workers. So it helped in troubleshooting internal challenges, such as tensions around migrant and non-migrant identities or regional divisions among domestic workers. Through this, there was a clear recognition and the importance of being a collective identity, engaging with national platforms and domestic workers and building alliances. Also, as an output of the project, we also, when we developed these audio visuals, the movies and photo stories for the movement, it has really helped them in advocating their issues and the struggles, and they have continued to use those as well. So, but perhaps what this process is reinforced is that knowledge production, when done collaboratively, can itself become a tool for movement building. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Shira. That's really amazing. I'll hand over.
Thank you, Deepta. And we move to the final presentation conversation with Bangladesh. Sohela is leading this one with Saminapa. Sohela, Samina.
It's great to have Mahin online. I've been working with Mayapa since 2008. Mahin Sultan is a senior fellow of practice at BRAC Institute of Governance and Development. She's also a member of Naripakho, a feminist collective, and she was the member of Women's Affairs Reform Commission after Bangladesh's transition in 2024. So as you all perhaps know, that Bangladesh was having a moment in 2024 with the uprising, and now we had an election in 2026. But before we get to what is happening now and how the feminist movement is re-strategizing, we kind of need to know what happened before, particularly with the struggles we were working with. That is the government's workers' solidarity that we worked with, the Rape Law Reform Commission, the comprehensive sexuality education movement, and then Girls Not Brides that works to sort of prevent child marriage. Now, Mahin, my question to you is about the autocratic period that we had under Sheikh Hasina's rule since 2008. So we saw co-option of movement agendas in specific ways, and then movements navigating that and trying to hold space. So whichever example you want to pick up as sort of to illustrate what was going on and how movements were trying to hold policy space or popular space, do you want to elaborate what this autocratic co-option looked like and how movements strategized to fight back? Because co-option is connected to anti-gender backlash, as my colleagues were also talking about.
Okay, thank you, Sohela. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, yes.
Okay, just to start with, what did this autocratic context look like for Bangladesh and how did the co-option play out? The state has always, claimed to be very sympathetic towards gender equality, women's empowerment. We use these terms a lot. But we could see that they used a lot of tokenistic measures, I'd say, to bolster their legitimacy, both internationally and nationally. So they decided to take on and promote certain objectives from the women's movement, from the women's development, agenda, but being very selective about what they would do and what they wouldn't do, while limiting who could engage, how far they could engage, and on what they could engage. So, you've been using the terms of gender washing and gender bashing. We could see that in the sense of that to promote, to look good, we're working on violence, we're working on education, we're working on violence. But when it came down to really dealing with issues of power, relationships of power and violence, those issues were, pushed under the table. So, and it also, in sense of bashing, discrediting various debates when you wanted to talk about bodily rights, sexuality, or, things like consent. So it was being symbolic in the sense of what could be done, what couldn't be done, co-opting the language, vilifying the activists, which happened later as well, but also during the autocratic regime. But in terms of strategies that were taken to cope, we could see that the movements insisted on staying at the table, not going away and becoming invisible. So I will specifically talk about the rape law reform movement, since we can't cover 4. So there was a way of reframing the agenda and choosing which parts of the agenda could be taken forward and which parts would be too contentious. For example, not talking about the death penalty outright, or not talking about issues of consent or sexual diversity. But on the Evidence Act, for example, there were areas where it was easier to move forward. So going forward with those, engaging with allies, because it was a legal framed often in a legalistic way. So engaging with the allies in the parliament, in the law ministry, where there were people who would be willing to listen. Also taking alternative strategies, like when the work around the reform of the Evidence Act wasn't going forward through advocacy alone, also using public interest litigation to force the government to respond, and which worked well. And because also another strategy was that of using evidence, building up evidence to convince people with facts and figures and case studies that this is what was happening and the change that needed to be done. So I think we have to understand that these movements were very strategic in deciding which parts of the state could be dealt with, where, when, what. There was a lot of backlash as well that needed to be dealt with. For example, when the rape law reform, one of their main points is that punishment should be proportionate to the crime. But this is something the state chose, that just to satisfy the public, to increase punishment. And we know that increasing punishment doesn't always result in, justice for the victims. But those were areas where there was a pushback, where the state took these measures to satisfy public opinion, but which went against the interests of the rape law reform movement. But so there were times when the movement had to stay quiet about this, and other times when it could come forward with the demands and visibilize what needed to be done. So I think moving on, so Hela, if you would talk a little bit about what other strategies movements in Bangladesh have been doing that are perhaps unique or different from the other countries.
This is the South Asia question, right? How are we different from other South Asian countries? To understand that, if we are doing anything different, we actually need to kind of look at, well, how is Bangladesh different from the other countries? So for example, Chandana talked about Pakistan context being quite hostile, and sort of the regime change kind of yo-yoing between military and civilian rule, right? Or, for example, in India, you now have an institutionalized religious political party, let's just call them that, because they are that, right? So for Bangladesh, remember I told you we are facing a moment in 2024, but in 2026, February, we had an election. And with that election, what we have is an institutionalization of right-wing political parties formally in government. It's not that they haven't been in government before, but now they're there in quite a large number. This is not something that women's movement had faced before. And this means that the type of politics that you will see in institutional spaces may change in a big way. The other bit is about, well, what about parties that would counter? Now, in Nepal, you have a left party. Of course, you can talk about what the Communist Party is doing and all of that. But left parties tend to be slightly different than right-wing parties. In India, you do have the left in different regions, not necessarily always in the center, but that's important. And then in Pakistan, you still have PPP. In Bangladesh, I don't see any of that kind of alternative at the moment. Our left has been very weak. The last bit where we are different is that we don't have decentralized power structures. So you heard from Shandana when she talked about diversity, when Miriam talked about diversification of power, devolution, or Nepal and India have federal states. So you have areas where you can contend. In Bangladesh, the power structure is quite centralized. So what that means is that basically your space for women's movement to engage in terms of institutional politics becomes quite limited if you're not aligned with the party that has supermajority. You're kind of in a weak position. So that's the context that we're in. So given that kind of power structure, are we doing anything that is dramatically different? Now, here is the surprising answer. The commonalities are quite interesting to look at, given that South Asian context varies so much in terms of the strategies that we kind of see. But what we are seeing happening in Bangladesh and what women's movement will be contending with, that has happened at other different junctures. So the temporality of it, what strategy you're using at what point in different South Asian countries vary. And that variation is interesting in terms of when do you pick up and what do you pick up at which point. So we are seeing a whole big discussion around women in politics, and given that the youth-led movement that you see younger women emerging as political leaders, that's not a moment we had before. Our politics was quite boring. It was two parties, cricket match, very boring. Then we had the autocrat, right? So it doesn't help, in terms of generating younger leaders. It's also about us now having to think about not just how do you deal with the right wing, but how do you deal with the right wing women? Because that's not something, it's not that they were not there, but we kind of have to think about it now because they're at the forefront. So we need strategies for that. But also in terms of, because the transitional government sort of constituted a reform process, and there were debates around reform and backlash against lots of reform that were proposed for gender equality. Now you have kind of a vision map, if you would say, and contestations around that is out in public, particularly in terms of in social media. So you have to think about social media strategies, and we are seeing new ways emerging in terms of how do you contend in popular discourse, right? Particularly issues around violence against women being quite prominent there, apart from women in politics. Now, what Bangladesh will be a test case of is that of the development narrative, because for a long time we have attached women's empowerment to development, and we have created spaces through that way, whether that's in the policy space or whether for ordinary women exercising agency. Now, whether that pathway stays with economic precarity increasing and what strategies we take to keep the space open for that is going to be critical for us. So having said that, in terms of what is unique for Bangladesh and what kind of things we are seeing emerging for the women's movement, Mahin, I just want to go deeper into the challenges that women's movement are facing now. There was space, transition created, the space has changed given elections. So where do you see what kind of challenges are emerging, and basically where do you see the shift in terms of women's movement using strategies or re-strategizing given those specific challenges?
Okay, as you have mentioned, with the transition, and the transition I think is still ongoing, in some areas we have some opportunities. I think there's greater freedom of the press. We seem to have a greater freedom of opinion, but that means freedom for all kinds of opinions. As you said, the elected representatives have come in. Some are younger, some are first-timers. The reform priorities have been reflected in the election manifestos. And we have a document called the July Charter, which many contest, but which has some reform items or agendas or things that have been agreed on. But now we're having to deal with right-wing parties. Jamaat is in a formal role as the opposition. there's misogyny in the social media and in the public, the economic crisis, etc. And also the lack of women in formal spaces. You know, the elections were a big nominations and then elections were a big disappointment. But I think one is still trying to understand what this new context is. But one of the strategies seems to be to amplify the voices and the demands. You know, there's a whole plethora of meetings, workshops, seminars, campaigns happening so that the parties and everybody knows about what the different demands are, what has been said, what we want from the new government, what we want from the new bureaucracy, bringing to the fore again what was discussed during the interim government, what is in the reform reports. We also have a whole list of ordinances that were passed by the interim government that need to be ratified by the parliament. So that's going to be another battle. And developing new relationships, finding the allies, finding the champions who among the politicians, among the bureaucracy, among this new sort of setup that we seem to have. And also, you know, holding the politicians to account for what they have promised in their manifesto, some of which sound very, very good. But I think it seems to be, you know, a period of uncertainty, but also one where people are determined to hold the ground, that, you know, we can't move back from here. We can only move forward.
Well, there's to holding the ground. And if you're interested to read more about co-option and what is happening, look for our paper in Contemporary South Asia.
Thanks for big hand to all of our speakers for the conversation. I'm going to now open up the floor to questions. I must admit, I wrote down a bunch of questions, but I will withhold mine and open up to the floor. Let's try and take a set before asking for responses. So over to you.
Hello, thank you so much. I feel so inspired, and it's so much work that you've done, and it's really incredible. So thank you for sharing all of that with us. I'd like to position myself first. So I research the Middle East, and I'm based in Central Europe. So my questions are coming kind of from that trajectory. I'm wondering about the role of funding in all of your works. Yeah, so I know that we're seeing globally a decrease in funding for gender and feminist causes, and maybe a rise in the funding of right-wing causes, right, and conservative ones. So how is that impacting you? My second question, if you can get to it, but you don't have to, is also around queer sexuality and sexual diversity. So you've mentioned that you've worked, some of you have worked on this a little bit. And yesterday we talked a little bit about how those strategies of working towards diverse sexualities and queer rights, etc., can be various. So are you working more like head on, or are you still working kind of, inadvertently or indirectly, right? So if we have a concrete example, I'd really appreciate it. And then finally, this is coming from more of, my engagement in Palestine activism in Central Europe. So one of the things that we've been looking at is how to turn repression into action. And basically that means, that we are predicting, at this point, we're quite good at knowing the grammar of how repression against Palestinian academics and Palestinians works, in Central and Eastern Europe. So we kind of, instigate those moments because we know that we can use them to to further a specific cause or to create discourse, etc. Does this resonate with some of your work? Because I've seen that one of the findings was that a backlash actually is generative. So I'm wondering if it's also being actually used as a strategy. Thank you so much.
We'll take a couple more. Naila and then Saki.
This is to Sohaila, but it relates to the others. You were trying to work out what is different about Bangladesh, right? But I felt like you focused very much on the present moment and on the political environment in these different countries. I think what is very different about Bangladesh is post-47, it became one of those fluid, the most potentially egalitarian societies because a very homogeneous society, ethnic identity, ethno-linguistic identity is very homogeneous. You had small minorities, religion and ethnicity. Both India and Pakistan, and I think Nepal, have had far more feudalistic, caste-ridden structures. And they have kept in place people at the bottom. So the hope of rising was very restricted. Even if the Bangladeshi government, one after the other since 47 or since 71, have engaged in the rhetoric of gender equality, it is far better than the rhetoric of patriarchy. And it has been possible in Bangladesh for one government after the other, whether they meant it or not. But if you think discourse is important, then this discourse is also important. That it became possible to fight around women's rights, even if the government wasn't prepared to make the moves. So I think that explains quite a lot about what is quite. And the other thing, by the by, Bangladesh is the only country in the world which is all delta. All other countries have bits of them on delta. That means the entire history and geography and culture of Bangladesh is shaped by complete uncertainty, unpredictability. And I think the culture that we've grown up over the years is, in a sense, you place your faith in God, but whichever God works. So it might be, Buddhist God, whatever. So we've always embraced religions that go against the kind of the patriarch or the social norm. And I just reading this book by Pranab Pandhan about insecurities. And that's one of the things he says it about most of South Asia, Vaishnav, Buddhism, Sufism, all of this. But I think in Bangladesh it took on a very particular form, and it allowed us to have a far more pluralistic idea of Islam than perhaps existed in other parts of Asia.
Thanks, Nila. Very interesting.
Yeah, so the session is quite insightful for me. So I have two questions. First is all about one about the. I heard that in Nepal there is a backlash from the dominant feminist movement. So I would like to understand how does it look like, how they are doing dominating the space. And second, that there are in this project you chosen 16 different moments. The countries like India, it's very vast, and we have a lot of prominent moments and this lot of emerging moments. So how do you choose amongst them? So in this context, that was quite. These are my two questions. Thank you.
Let's take one more because the time is short. It's better to take the questions and hear reactions. Yes, and online.
One was a question for
we just do a round of questions.
So one question for the India team, just information about why there was a comment about Sharia Adalats being a trusted space, if you could expand on that. And the other question was for Sahila and Mahin Mo. I think the Nepali colleague mentioned about how there is a however, and post-political transition, marginalized communities and rights seem to have fallen out of the agenda, or not to have been prioritized. Do you feel the same?
Let's go to some online questions as well to throw into the mix.
Thank you. Yeah, we have about 4 online questions. So the first question is, as backlash evolves across South Asia in various forms and platforms, how do feminist movements stay politically bold without being diluted through co-optation or forced neutrality? Observed more after the recent fund cuts from one of the biggest funders, and now because of various implications, lots of social movements and the organizations supporting them have to mute themselves. So that's the first one. The second one is, have you seen ways in which women's movements are addressing internal fissures in this time, or are they ignoring these in the face of ever severe backlash they face externally? Have there been particular methodologies you've used to surface these tensions? We have another question that says, as backlash intensifies and changes forms, how do movements make the choices around when to adapt their narrative versus hold firm? Are there examples where a narrative shift has opened new funding or solidarity opportunities, but also created new vulnerabilities or co-optation risks. And then finally, someone really liked the quote from Mona about what is the point of solidarity if the solidarity isn't solid? So in what ways do you think that the feminist movements that you all worked with demonstrated this solidarity? How did it manifest, either within the movements themselves or between the movements?
Thank you. I will hand over to people online first. Could you raise your hand if you're willing to take one or more of these questions online? Mona, Maheen, Mariam, Mubashira. There, Mubashira, go for it.
Yeah, there was a question on what do we mean by Sharia Adalat as a trusted space. We're referring to Auraton ki Sharia Adalat. I mean, it's something that a counter institution that Burma has created against the religious institutions that adjudicate on personal matters or marital conflicts and such. So Auraton ki Sharia Adalat is where women, Muslim women, are trained in feminist Islamic interpretations of Quran, and they from the lens of women and their lived experiences, adjudicate, just to say that we no longer need male patriarchs or religious clerics to intervene, and women themselves can, take care of these issues from a women's lens, a feminist lens. So that is where this trusted space comes in. I also wanted to briefly address the question on funding in India. What we have been seeing, at least in these four movements, is that the movements are also registering a sanghatan or a trust, an organization that can take projects or funding and can support movement activities. This is because the movements are realizing that funding is shrinking, and in fact, it's being used to shut their activities. So Burma, for instance, has a trust, it's called Ashiana Trust, and that takes in projects. Also, there is a lot of retail funding that is being explored. Also, professionals within the movement, take on their own work, engage in different occupations and support their movement activities as well. In the context of rural movement like Samarthan Mahila Sangathan, they're exploring the idea of setting up farmer-producer company or a cooperative to also fund their movement activities. So there are these different other ways in which financial resilience is being built in these movements. Thanks.
Thanks, Mubashira. I'm going to ask another online speaker to speak before I hand the mic over to here. If anyone doesn't volunteer, maybe Mona? Mona has her hand up.
Yes, thank you, Anu. I'm not sure if I heard all the questions, but then whichever I picked, I will try to answer with the experience that we gathered in Nepal. And thank you for liking my quote. That's my how to say that copyright quote now. I don't know, how it is in other countries, but with the brief understanding of South Asia, and also after listening from other colleagues and the struggles during the movement, again, this research, I feel like in a various forms it resides in other countries as well, and in South Asia itself, especially how these dominant feminist movement acts. The reason that I said that is, I don't know, how many of you are aware of it? Some years back, I appreciate it, but at the same time, it brought out several nuanced aspects of women's movement in Nepal. There was a huge cry around Diju feminist, and the reason that was debated. There was a conversation in social media, but also in physical platforms, and all those things were because the feminist movement was very much governed by the feminists from one um, group, social group, mostly elitists. Um, they were part of the movement. They were speaking, about the women's agenda, the rights and all, mostly liberal feminist and all. However, very much co-opted by the power, especially the political power, or sometimes even by the funders, very much NGOized, and thus it didn't capture the voice of marginal group. And as I was also sharing during my during my sharing earlier, like how this political situation will bring justice, social justice for the women and girls. And I said, how um, the political leaders will be able to center the margin. That is something it has it should be very intentional. And these two feminists, though, were working on the women's rights agenda, the class aspect was something which was not cracked, and thus the margins voice was not centered, and thus the leadership was captured by one group. That was something which we had noticed. The other thing is, one of the struggles in Nepal, JMMS, along with several demands that they had, their one demand was also to decriminalize the work that they were doing. And at that time, sadly, the established women's movement, rather than accepting them and supporting them and showing solidarity and alliance in any form that they could, they were rather moralizing them. They were rather trying to sift them for a different livelihood actions and all those things, and rather than accepting them. So those kind of these are some examples that I'm giving. And then Priya, I know you were also part of Nepal, Dipta, you can also share. So that's why it was very tough. And also the established movement and the leaders in Nepal not accepting the movement or struggles led by the young groups, and not regarding them as a leader. Like, as I said, the Girls' Rights Forum, the young leaders speaking on their agenda of child marriage, to stop it, to have a strong legal system, justice system, the monitoring mechanism and all. Women's movement not being able to accept it, accept their leadership, provide that kind of space, that itself also tells, how the dominant movement actors are very, probably it can be controversial, but I'll just say it because it is like that, very patriarchal and feudalistic in their action too. And this is a fact. And I think, we should have that courage to share these kind of things that's happening within the movement. But what I loved about it is having that courage to speak about it, which I have not seen in other social movement, but in women's movement. And to have that courage and to speak about it means to reform it, for that action. So that's why I was talking about that. I was telling, the dominant group have really, not allowed that. But then there was another thing I will briefly share, not explain much. Someone asked, how the backlash was generative. Priya will also share, and then earlier also she has. When I shared that, it was not shared to, to romanticize backlash. The harm that struggle faced was very real, and I've seen, how difficult time they faced. But the reality and the insight is that the movement don't only, struggle, these backlash. They also learn and then they recraft themselves, they reform themselves. And sometimes it also helps them to collectively come together with a better strategy, with a better collective action, So that's why I was saying, like, it is painful, it is harmful, but it is also regenerative. Yeah, thank you.
I also suggest that everybody, including our speakers in the room, if they want to pick questions, they can answer in the chat as well. I'm going to hand over the mic to Shandana. Very briefly respond to.
I will be very brief, but in response to three different questions, but very quickly, the question on funding. Here, I just wanted to say the general sense of Pakistan, and I guess Bangladesh as well, is that there's this NGOization of movements, and especially in the Pakistan case, a lot of that money has come from outside. A lot of that story is true, but of these 4 movements that we worked with, only one falls into that category. And so the others were not funded from outside. And so the effect on them in that sense would not be big, but it is very big because there are CSO actors who will struggle because of the reduced funding, who made space within which these struggles could then find support and allies. And also the impact on research, what that reduced funding is going to do to the research on these movements and the space that that creates. All of these are very real effects, even if they're not directly taking money from external actors. Naila, your point about Bangladesh reminded me that I wanted to say quite strongly what's coming out of SuPWR, and the point that we really want to push is the fact that even in those other 3 very more patriarchal, more feudal, more unstable situations, what is happening is that these, what has surprised us very much, is the extent to which these struggles are finding space under those circumstances. So we've always seen Bangladesh as having it slightly easier in that sense, but it's really incredible the extent to which these spaces are being created and the extent to which they're moving forward. So especially in Pakistan's case, we think of it as the least likely case of success. And so it's quite exciting when we say that. And very quickly to the question of adaptation, to find a pattern is really hard because a lot of how you strategize in the face of backlash happens because of a configuration in that moment. So it's so different each time. When you get blamed, for example, one of our speakers said yesterday, when you get blamed for getting money from Epstein, how do you respond in that moment? What teaches you to respond in that moment? But what I wanted to say here is I really also want to take the focus away from the idea that they're just reacting to backlash or that the entire resistance is to backlash. They really are moving beyond the backlash to define a lot of what this space looks like, and very often deciding that we don't want to engage with that backlash anymore. We just want to move ahead with the work that we're doing.
Thank you. I wonder if Mahina or Mariam would like to come in here. If not, I'm going to hand over to Priya.
Thanks. I'm going to pick up on the questions.
Yes, just a quick add-on.
Go ahead, Mariam.
Go ahead, Mariam.
Go ahead, Mariam. We'll come back to you in a second. Go ahead.
Okay. Sorry, I was just going to quickly add on to connection. So
Mariam, your connection's not working. If you could try again in a few minutes, we'll just stay in the room for another few minutes, yeah?
Yeah.
So quickly on this really interesting question with what's happening with Palestine organization and the ways in which we can turn repression into resistance. And I really like what you said, when the sort of narrative grammar of oppression becomes predictable, can you use that to expose the brutality of the opposition, to insist on the moral righteousness of the cause? And I think it was only when you asked that I started to think about whether this sort of poking the bear and inviting or provoking backlash actually happens. But as Mona said, I think there's a very good reason it doesn't happen, because of the enormous cost and a recognition that that cost is, again, often borne by the most marginal and the most vulnerable. So I think a really important caveat to this reading of backlash as generative or productive is that sober recognition of the cost that comes with. And again, that isn't evenly borne.
Thanks. Mariam, are you ready to come in now? Mariam? Okay, let's move to Maheen Appa. If you have the mic, Maheen Appa.
Thanks. I was just thinking about the issue of, well, one is I'd like to react and I think there are differences across countries, but the backlash from within the movement is nowhere as strong as the backlash from outside. And I think, at least in Bangladesh, the movements have been getting better at working across different sectors, across different generations, and dealing with differences, because there's enough of a problem dealing with the outside resistance. So that's one. Another is dealing with ethnic minorities and other specific interest groups. The interim period, the transition opened up space for a little bit, where, for example, Chittagong Hill Tracks issues could come to the front. The gender diversity issues could come to the front, but these were quickly brushed aside, and it became difficult to deal with it. And we found that the autocratic regime was more open to dealing with gender diversity than our so-called democratic regimes. So we have to sort of deal with these contradictions now.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Sohela, because she's itching on her seat to say something. So, go ahead, Sohela.
I'm going to respond to a few questions, but in terms of why autocratic regimes pick up it's important to think through not just when spaces exist, and sometimes spaces may exist when you have autocratic rulers. But the question is, what does it do to that agenda? Because the agenda gets compromised and co-opted in particular ways, and there is a cost, long-term cost and trade-off associated with that. But as movements, it's very difficult if you leave the table, because you will definitely be on the menu. That doesn't necessarily mean that if you're at the table, you can influence it a lot, but these are closed spaces. What state does is it happens in closed spaces, and it's important to be in that space, even if those are co-opted spaces. Having said that, it's also important to interrogate what we mean by democracy, because democracies don't always deliver on gender equality. It is a constitutive part when I think about democracy, but not everyone thinks about democracy that way. And it's important to remember that how do we then create strength that allows you to contend, because elections are a big part, but it's not just elections, in terms of how do you design your democracy, because that is the moment we are facing in Bangladesh. Just very quickly also to talk about how we thought about in SuPWR in terms of spaces for women's movement. So Shandana, I, and rest of the team, we have been struggling with trying to develop this typology, which political scientists love. Rest of the other social scientists don't necessarily so. But of course, the research focuses on the contemporary moment, so we are looking at political configurations. But we had to also grapple with how do we deal with the colonial history, because the woman question was settled in particular ways, religion features in particular ways, along with other power hierarchies in society. And what we found out, initially we were thinking about, can we place South Asian countries in a spectrum? And then when we started off with, we were like, okay, Pakistan is very hostile, and then where the others fit, with Nepal having a democracy. But now what we had to come to and think about is, given our struggles are different types, and they also operate at the subnational, and there's politics at the regional level. So what is the configuration there, along with social power structures, and where would it fit? Having said that, for Bangladesh, we have been lucky in terms of that the elite, whatever composition of elites you had, they favored the development agenda, and we kind of coattailed on that. We are going to be tested now because of who has come into power, but also because of the economic precarity we are facing. So if we can't sustain that, then the usual pathways, which Naila, you talked about in your book in terms of the government sector and other bits and work opportunities opening up. If those opportunities go, we are facing a different kind of pushback, and we may not be as lucky in terms of the South Asians. I do have stuff on queer sexualities I can talk to you later.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we have lost Mariam. Her connection's been a bit unstable, so we'll have to wait for her comments or responses to the questions for another time. I'm going to give the last word to Deepta.
Just very quickly, how to choose amongst India's struggles, but actually how to choose amongst all of these struggles. We did have a selection criteria. We had house, different space, 4 different spaces in which these struggles work: state, market, community, family. And also had sort of an idea of the fact that these struggles must have had some form of success to a previous backlash, but are still existing. So that was the thing. We can talk later in more detail about that. But I really wanted to talk about this last question of how solidarity manifested, because that is so important. And how do you address these internal fissures? How do you stay political? And I think part of that is Nancy Fraser calls recognition, right? The recognition of not just the issues, but also the diversity of identities, the diversity of generational perspectives, the diversity of just sort of political stances, and then kind of really showing up and caring and building trust is so important for these movements to stay political. And in terms of a sort of a redistribution of these spaces, but also a reflection within these shared spaces, which is what really enhanced that solidarity. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's give another hand to all of our speakers. We're way out of time, and we've been start with a question. I know we're ahead of time. Sorry about that. Luckily, it's not for me to summarize this extensive research and discussion, but we do have Samreen who's going to say a few closing words. Samreen. Sorry.
Thankfully, now that I'm here, I can choose not to really synthesize what has been said, because from what we've heard of backlash and strategies from our movement partners, from in-country researchers, and from the IDS fellows, has been so articulate and brilliant that I don't think I could do justice to really trying to synthesize all of that. But I do have 2 brief reflections that I really want to share. One is that since my time at IDS, I joined towards the end of 2023, this SuPWR is the primary project I've really been working on, alongside brief work on 2 other projects that studied backlash. And what I've come to increasingly recognize is the importance of ensuring that activists who are at the front lines of resisting backlash and moving forward are at the center of knowledge production on backlash. And what we believe and hope that the SuPWR project has been able to make possible is to understand these movements on their own terms as they set the terms of the debate, placing their experiences of resistances to backlash, as well as moving forward in spite of that backlash, at the center of our work, and equally co-constructing spaces where struggles, movement partners, researchers across borders come together to claim spaces, to reclaim collective spaces as spaces of shared vulnerability and collective care. And while these interventions might be methodologically and ethically complex, for example, how do you name movements and strategies in a time that could compound the risk that movements face? Or how do you ensure you aren't simply transporting Eurocentric narratives and flattening analytical and conceptual diversity that you see in these regions and movements in terms of what constitutes as backlash? Which movements get invisibilized or visibilized in this process? Or how do you determine the effectiveness and success of these strategies in a time when more measurable outcomes tend to be more privileged? But equally, these interventions are crucial in a time when these movements are sought to be violently repressed, silenced, or co-opted. And so there's an urgent need not to divest from this task really, but to enter into it with collective responsibility and accountability. And over the last few days, especially leading up to this event, the many conversations we've had with each other, there's this feeling of dissonance and discomfort underlying these conversations, because how do you speak about the end of a project, and how do you reconcile with the fact that a project is ending when there's no end to the backlash that you're really talking about, and when these struggles for a better world really continue? And so it is imperative that we find ways to hold each other to account, that we stay accountable to those who entrusted us with their stories and their vulnerabilities. And so even as we speak of this today as the final dissemination event, what we really hope is for this to be an invitation for all of us studying backlash to constantly remind each other of that responsibility and ethic of care towards the movements, through constantly centering these margins, as we've heard over the last 2 days. And it is their work at the grassroots, their resistance to backlash, and their everyday struggle for survival that really needs to be resourced and amplified in these times. Thank you so much.